I'm Saul Olean, and I'll be chairing this event. I'd like to remind you first that the event is being recorded, and we intend to make the recording available publicly. There will be time for questions at the end, as well as discussion. Please submit your questions either using the chat function or at the time of the discussion, feel free to use the raise hand function if you prefer. We'll make every effort to try to field your questions in the order they were received. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Carolyn J. Dean, the Charles J. Stille Professor of History and French at Yale University. Professor Dean received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1987. Specializing in modern French history, she is the author of numerous journal articles and essays, as well as 6 books, most recently, The Moral Witness, Trials and Testimony After Genocide, published by Cornell University Press in 2019, and Aversion and Erasure, The Fate of the Victim After the Holocaust, published by Cornell in 2010. She has received fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies, as well as a Fulbright Research Award that took her to France. In 1996, she was named Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Council for Advancement and Support of Education, Rhode Island Professor of the Year. Professor Dean taught at Brown from 1991 to 2013 and served as Associate Dean of the Faculty here from 2005 to 2011. Tonight, she will present our 2021 Arthur B. and David B. Jacobson Lecture on Anti-Semitism. Her title is The Cultural Meaning of Genocide and the Moral Witness in the 20th and 21st Centuries. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn Dean back to Brown.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you, Saul, for the introduction. I always get embarrassed when you mentioned that the Carnegie Award was for a Professor of the Year in Rhode Island, and usually people are not particularly impressed by that because they don't realize how many people there are in Rhode Island, though I always have to insist that it means something, but it was very important to me when I got it. And I think about that as a wonderful time at Brown. So I'm going to begin this talk. I have made it, compressed it a great deal. So ideally, if there are questions about dimensions of the talk that I could not bring out, please, I would encourage them. So let me begin with a slide, just a picture of Raphael Lemkin. Thank you. In 1944, the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin coined the neologism genocide to define a crime that could not be reduced to mass murder. For Lemkin, who sought to define the crime represented by the murder of European Jewry, the essence of genocide was a systematic attack on a group of people and its cultural identity. It was a crime against difference itself. Lemkin's view was pared down in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. For political and legal reasons, the drafters defined the violation to encompass only the physical destruction of specific groups, emphasizing the planned and deliberate nature of the killing over its assault on cultural identity, as if the two were not inextricable. It was finally the Western reception of Holocaust victim testimony that defined genocide as radically transgressive and incommensurable, transforming the animus that motivated the killing and the unfathomable cultural and linguistic loss it engendered into a phenomenon whose meaning transcended physical destruction. My talk today addresses 2 episodes in the history of how genocide became culturally legible, to ask how the Holocaust became paradigmatic of genocide. It also asks how that history defined which victims mattered and why. I analyze a longer history of how publics distinguish the experience of what Lemkin would eventually name genocide from mass murder. Scholars tell two different stories about this process. The first, more familiar to most of us, begins with victim testimony during the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem and ends by reference to the outsized role played by victims in contemporary genocide prosecution. It is recounted most of the time as the rise and fall of the Holocaust from belated recognition in the 1960s to iconic status during the 1980s and to fallen idol a decade later, when Holocaust memory was packaged, sold, and exported so widely for consumption that one scholar dubbed the period the era of the witness. This is, the slide is Elie Wiesel, essentially comparing Holocaust testimony to the sonnet and the epistle. Victims initially struggle for recognition in this narrative, and their experience was finally acknowledged, if belatedly, but Holocaust memory was finally evacuated of substance and eventually transformed into a secular religion. This is a Google Ngram, obviously not particularly scientific, and it covers only the English language, but it does give you a sense of what happened. You can see that genocide, obviously it's coined actually in 1944. It becomes more prominent after the Eichmann trial in the 60s. Again, there's a bit of a more, it's obviously used more around the late 70s, and by 2000, which corresponds with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and also with the recognition, widespread recognition of the Holocaust, genocide is used constantly, and I will talk about that later. So that was the first story. The second story is a political and legal history of how the Allied powers, fearful of potential claims against their leaders and empires, depoliticized genocide in the 1948 Genocide Convention. They reduced its application to the physical destruction of a racial, ethnic, or religious group motivated by its members' identity, a definition that excluded murders of political opponents, expulsions, cultural destruction, and other politically motivated acts that Lemkin had originally included in his description of genocide. Initially, the last narrative I spoke about that begins with the belated recognition of the Holocaust and ends with its iconic status, they seem aligned, but then they diverge. For the second story, these acts, now rationalized in the name of security, the Allies differentiated these acts, from the Holocaust, that is the acts of expulsions and the extermination of political opponents, using the language of civilization and violations of human conscience to cast the event as the uniquely evil extermination of millions of innocents for no other reason than who they were. So let me read that again, because I don't think it was very clear. So the Allies differentiated these acts, which had originally been included in the definition of genocide and then excluded. They differentiated these acts of expulsions, cultural destruction, and other politically motivated crimes. They differentiated these from the Holocaust, using the language of civilization and violations of human conscience to cast the event, that is the Holocaust, as the uniquely evil extermination of millions of innocents for no other reason than who they were. Victim groups, Lemkin included, supported the great powers as their best hope for a Jewish state in Palestine. They too proffered the uniqueness narrative, which mainstreamed and remains pervasive. Now, this narrative has been percolating for about a decade. It's associated with a certain post-colonial discourse, and it has been most recently put on the map by Dirk Moses, who some of you may be familiar with, who just wrote a book called Problems of Genocide, that Saul Friedlander, that has gotten a lot of press in Germany and has been the subject of much debate, including a rebuttal by Saul Friedlander, and we can talk about that later. So both of these narratives are ultimately interpretations of the role of Holocaust memory and its effects on contemporary culture. One view contends that its global reception transformed a singular event into kitsch, and the other that its ostensible singularity blotted out the recognition of past and ongoing colonial crimes as genocides. Both of these narratives are ultimately about how Holocaust memory triumphed and with what effects. One view contends that its global reception transformed a singular event into kitsch, and the other, sorry, I treat the Holocaust survivor as the crystallization of a witness to genocide with prior rhetorical incarnations in the long 20th century. I analyzed two European interwar trials, using them as microcosms of historical and conceptual developments that became essential to making a distinction between the moral transgression of mass murder and that of genocide. Rather than use the Holocaust as a point of departure, I focus on how the symbolic power of the witness tracks the history of how Western Europeans constructed the cultural rather than legal meaning of mass violence, and how local terrorism against ethnic groups was first rendered problematic, albeit within an older vocabulary of moral transgression, including barbarism, references to barbarism, and violations of human conscience. I make two arguments. First, that the trial narratives gave victims voices credibility and integrated them into broad moral communities. And second, that the making of moral witnesses to genocide was inextricable from a process of cultural redemption that managed specific social anxieties about victims' objection and audiences' need either for moral self-affirmation or later absolution. The Eichmann trial and its afterlife exemplified the most highly significant iteration of these phenomena in a new language. The production of the Holocaust and the Holocaust survivor was not merely a political or legal process, but a complex cultural development that both reiterated Western hegemony and incorporated victims into a narrative they shaped but did not define. This cultural legacy defines the difference between the Holocaust and genocide. I recount the trial in 1921 of Soghomon Tehlirian, an Armenian avenger of the Armenian genocide, and in 1927 of Shalom Schwarzbart, a Jewish avenger of the Ukrainian pogroms of 1918-19. Both were accused of murder, Tehlirian of assassinating an Ottoman official responsible for ordering the Armenian genocide, and Schwarzbart of shooting the alleged instigator of the Ukrainian pogroms. These were the first major trials in Western Europe featuring victims of interethnic violence and state-sponsored mass atrocities seeking justice. They caught the young Raphael Lemkin's attention. Hannah Arendt claimed that they illustrated the importance of an international criminal court. Lawyers used these trials to bring the Armenian genocide and the Ukrainian pogroms into Western public view, even though the defendants were themselves accused of murder. Like the Eichmann trial 40 years later, the proceedings spotlighted mass atrocities, used victim testimony in highly unusual, if defensible ways, put victims center stage to teach the public about their plights, and provided multilingual forums for their revelations. Both defendants were acquitted after juries heard blood-curdling accounts of the Armenian massacres and the military invasions of Ukrainian villages. The verdicts decreed that the shooters had momentarily lost control of their free will, in both cases because the defense showcased the atrocities that had pushed each man to lose his composure rather than the murders they had committed. Since each trial's official purpose was not to seek justice for victims of pogroms or genocide, they do not overlap easily with the categories of international criminal law or with the history of human rights. And there are people that have tried to make them fit into these categories, but it doesn't work. But in the absence of an established legal category with which courts could prosecute state-directed mass murder, the proceedings provided a forum for publicizing atrocities in the defendant's words in court and to the press. What victims could say in the courtroom and how they could say it defined experiences whose recounting strained the narrative coherence of established legal defenses. Although the proceedings invoked the norms associated with the rhetoric of Western civility and patriotic combat, they also shifted familiar ideas about human suffering and survival that were as important to the outcome of the proceedings as legal argument alone. Together with other trials, most importantly that of Adolf Eichmann, they form a genealogy of the contemporary moral witness. In the mid-morning of March 15th, 1921, Saddam and Tellerian shot Talat Pasha in an affluent neighborhood in Berlin. Talat, one of the men responsible for planning the 1915 Armenian genocide, had been among the highest-ranking officials at the Ottoman court and fled to Berlin to avoid trial by the Allies after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. He was targeted for assassination by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, an important Armenian political party whose leaders assigned the job to Tellerian. This is his house. It is a gas company now in Istanbul. Nonetheless, there is a memorial right outside of it. And he is memorialized in a museum in which this is actually the blood on the back of the shirt, the blood he shed when he was killed. As Talat was out for his morning walk, Tellerian shot him through the back of the head at close range and sought to escape, but bystanders cornered him and hailed the police. The Armenian assassin was brought to trial a few weeks later on charges of premeditated murder after a hasty preliminary investigation. Worried about being condemned to death for a political murder, he played the role of an anguished man whose epileptic fits were brought on by his memories of the genocide. Correspondence between the German Foreign Office and one of Tellerian's defense lawyers indicates that the Weimar government acted to limit, and in one case prohibited, the testimony of a diplomat at the trial in order not to expose the extent of German complicity in the Armenian genocide. As has now been amply demonstrated, the Germans acted as a counterinsurgency force in Anatolia, where the genocide took place. And slide, there's a map in case anybody doesn't know or is curious. This is a map of the deportations. This Foreign Office may have hoped for a conviction in order not to alienate its former Turkish allies, but it was also concerned that the German army not be implicated in crimes against the Armenians. These government measures did not prevent the trial from becoming a cause célèbre, but shortened Tellerian's time in the public eye and turned testimony away from the German army's misdeeds to the defendant's distress over witnessing the murder of his mother and his brothers and the kidnapping of one of his sisters. The trial lasted 2 days, from June 2nd to June 3rd, 1921. Medical experts could not agree on whether Tellerian was responsible for his act, but agreed with one exception that his epilepsy might have compromised his free will. What never came out in the trial was that Tellerian did not witness the genocide because he was off fighting with the Russian army. When he returned home, he found a brother alive and the town abandoned. The prosecution also never brought out any involvement in the organized plot to pursue Talat. The trial became a media sensation. As you may remember from the slide a few slides ago, it was actually covered by the Herald Tribune. The judge's opening interrogation revealed his sympathy for the defendant, whom he probed gently about his experiences. Tellerian recounted his story calmly, beginning with the Ottoman order to leave his village in 1915, the robbery of their convoy by troops who stole their valuables, and then bursts of gunfire, at the sound of which a soldier dragged his sister away and his mother screamed, "May I go blind?" Tellerian said he could no longer bear to think about their suffering. "I do not want to be reminded of that day. It is better for me to die." At the judge's prompting, Tellerian described the murder of his mother and brother. He acknowledged that about 2 weeks before he assassinated Talat, he kept, quote, "seeing the scenes of the massacres over and over. I saw my mother's corpse. The corpse stood up before me and told me, 'You know Talat is here, and yet you do not seem to be concerned. You are no longer my son,' unquote." The district attorney who prosecuted Tellerian played it safe, avoiding questions about his relationship, about Talat's relationship with the German army. He echoed the testimony of General Otto Liman von Sanders, head of the German military mission in the Ottoman Empire, who declared that the German army was shocked by the massacres. The defense attorney, Johannes Werthauer, also negated the real ties between Talat and Germany by calling to the stand a surviving Armenian bishop who thanked the Germans for saving him from the Turks. Testimonies came from a wide range of eminent witnesses, including Armenians. A woman from Anatolia described how 4 groups of 500 families from her village were evacuated. At some point, men were separated from the group, tied together, and thrown into the river while those who remained watched. The judge then asked who was responsible, and she accused Talat Pasha, because the Turkish guards forced some of their victims to kneel and cry, "Long live the Pasha." Once evidence of the atrocities had been established and confirmed by credible authorities, Tellerian's lawyers sought to exculpate their client. Werthauer acknowledged that Talat may have been a decent fellow, but called him a member of a militarist cabinet. And I quote, "A militarist is a person opposed to justice. A militarist is not an individual who is a member of the military by calling. It is possible to be an officer or a soldier, wear a uniform, use weapons, and at the same time not be a militarist. The officer or soldier himself can uphold the principles of right and justice and perform his duties as a member of the military at the same time. On the other hand, there are countless militarists who have never put on a uniform. They sit at a desk, write articles, and fiercely defend the flag of brute force." Unquote. These militarists, the lawyer explained, annihilated the Armenians. They formed a distinctive new caste, he exclaimed, capable of deporting a whole nation. In contrast, he continued, Tellerian was like the Swiss patriot William Tell, who killed a tyrant to save his people. The defense thus asked the audience to associate Tellerian's act with honor, displaced the German army's responsibility for murderous deeds onto Turks now cast as militarists, and realigned German loyalists from the Ottoman Empire to the murdered Armenian nation. But how did the court reconcile a compulsively committed, unintentional act with an honorable one? The lawyers portrayed Tellerian as a soldier. They insisted that his mind was gripped by a revolt against the memory of his unbearable submission to the militarist whims. To survive and honor the deaths of those with whom his life was once entwined, he felt compelled to avenge them. The lawyers transformed Tellerian's alleged loss of free will into the unrestrainable force of human conscience. This peculiar transfiguration of an assassin into a righteous avenger and a willful murder into an act of consciousness, in fact, succeeded. The prosecution failed to convict, and Tellerian walked out of the courtroom a free man. I'm now going to talk about Schwarzbart, and then I will move to wrap things up. On May 25th, 1926 in Paris, Shalom Schwarzbart, a Bessarabian Jewish watchmaker, committed a similar crime of vengeance. He had come to France in 1910, fought in the Great War on France's side, and acquired French nationality. In 1917, he fought with anarchist forces in Odessa. After returning to Paris, Schwarzbart learned that Shimon Petlura, former head of the short-lived Ukrainian National Republic, had been living there since 1924, where he was head of the Ukrainian government in exile. Petlura had been the commander of the Ukrainian army and had allegedly organized the 1917 pogroms that took some 50,000 Jewish lives. Schwarzbart shot him 5 times outside of a bistro. He was arrested and put on trial for 8 days from October 18 to October 26, 1927, after a pretrial investigation that lasted 17 months. And I would like you to look here. Both of these trials obviously lived on in the memory of the Armenian and Jewish communities, and there was a lot of lobbying by Jewish groups at the time. And you can see the importance of memory because there is a memorial plaque there's actually a street named after Schwarzbart in Beersheba, Israel. And as you can see here in 2004, a stamp was issued after the image of Petlura. Schwarzbart trial eventually revolved less around Schwarzbart's deed than around the atrocities committed in pogroms and whether the hetman, Shimon Petlura, had really organized and sanctioned them. Schwarzbart claimed that a Gentile Russian acquaintance in Paris had overheard officers from the White Russian army talking about their exploits in a hospital waiting room. One boasted that he had killed 15 Jews in a single day. When Schwarzbart heard the stories, he told the judge he was in a terrible state. I was present at some pogroms. I saw atrocities committed and I forced myself to forget them. This Russian who came to tell me these things awakened all these memories in me, and that had a huge impact. Schwarzbart claimed that Petlura's soldiers had a slogan on their armbands and hats: kill the Jews and save Ukraine. Other witness testimony bore out Schwarzbart's claim, not only about the atrocities committed in pogroms, but also about Petlura's responsibility. Elias Cherikauer, the famous Jewish historian, testified at the trial that Petlura was at least partially responsible for the pogroms. He responded that no one in Ukraine doubted his responsibility and recounted the Jewish community's multiple pleas with Petlura to stop the pogroms. Chaya Greenberg, a medical student, testified that she went to care for the wounded and discovered a massacre. The survivors had lost entire families, including young children, all murdered by soldiers wielding bayonets. A young woman of 19 heard the Ukrainians cry, "This is for our father, Petlura." The prosecution called witnesses to prove that claims about Petlura's responsibility were exaggerated or false. They testified to his great affection for the Jewish people. One claimed that the Bolsheviks themselves engaged in pogroms, so what Petlura did was simply what Petlura's men did was not unusual. A Ukrainian ex-military man proclaimed that he had struggled to prevent the Jewish colonization of Ukraine and to stop the Bolsheviks from creating a Jewish republic. A Russian colonel denied Petlura's responsibility for any massacres, stating that he regarded the pogroms against Jews to be the work of, quote, divinely inspired revenge. Torres, the defense lawyer, made hay of these statements, skillfully weaving a narrative about the pogroms into his cross-examination. He put to rest any questions about Schwarzbart's character by reference to his time as a French soldier. As Tellerian's lawyers compared his gesture to Wilhelm Tell, Torres claimed that Schwarzbart, after having fought for France, refused the passivity of his ancestral race. He treated the assassination as a crime of passion, the legal category usually used to acquit enraged husbands or wives who murdered their adulterous spouses. Torres repurposed the crime of passion defense to account for the defendant's uncontrollable response to memories of his pogroms, of the pogroms he had witnessed and his own parents' murder. He recast vigilantism as a quest for justice, transfiguring the murder of Petlura into a righteous act. The jury voted to acquit, and Schwarzbart walked out of the courtroom to much jubilation. Now, what to make of all this, and what is the relationship between these trials and the paradigmatic status of the Holocaust? That's what I'm going to try to explain now very, very briefly. These two interwar trials did not develop new legal categories of crimes or secure rights for victims. The acquittals, which were controversial, suggest that the courts were befuddled about how to hold the perpetrators of pogroms and mass murders accountable, except by showing mercy to their victims. But the creative, pedantic, uncannily similar defense strategies redeemed Tellerian's and Schwarzbart's crimes, justifying their acts by invoking the violence done to them and their families and placing the violence to which they had been subjected center stage. The lawyers had it both ways. They fused the traumatically wounded victim's compulsion with the willful courage of the soldier, transforming an intentional, brutal act into an honorable one. By portraying the defendants as patriotic heroes, the trials integrated them into the comedy of civilized nations, guaranteed their redemption, and demonstrated the degree to which recognition of their suffering was dependent on the terms of its cultural legibility. Ultimately, they told a story onto which patriotic redemption was only awkwardly grafted. For the source of Tellerian's and Schwarzbart's conscience, and hence their humanitarian wars on barbarism, originated in a trauma whose memory overtook all other reasons for living. Their enemies were not legitimate armies, but militarists whose killing was planned and deliberate. They targeted minority religious and ethnic groups who they deported or consigned to suffering and death. Some 40 years later, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem demonstrated that the conditions of Nazi camps made any resistance at all a miracle and freed the survivors from shame by incorporating their suffering into a story of national redemption. It also cast the survivors as symbols of living death, whose haunted presence embodied the transgressive violence perpetrated by genocidal regimes. The witness to genocide that emerged in the Jerusalem courtroom combined historical and conceptual developments of an earlier period into a coherent narrative through which genocide emerged as a culturally intelligible experience for the first time in the West, one against which previous crimes were compared. And this image is quite dramatic. I think you see her, Ara Lichtman, who was buried alive and whose families were all killed by the Einsatz group. And she is testifying with sunglasses, and the obviously policeman or security guard is obviously recoiling from her testimony. It's a very famous testimony. The interwar trials showcase these developments in process, which together form the conditions for the cultural redemption and recognition of victim suffering, never on their own terms. And that's very, very important for the argument I'm trying to make. They define violence targeting religious and national minorities abstractly as a violation of human conscience in accord with the civilizational narrative of moral transgression. But the trials also illustrate other shifts that complicate this apolitical narrative of the civilized spectator's dismay. And this is, I'm going to say, read this, but I just wanted to have this up because these are important points. They named and defined crimes against ethnic minorities not only as barbaric and regrettable, but as particular kinds of systemic, politically motivated violations. They incorporated victims' testimony into the comedy of so-called civilized nations, but in so doing also transformed their suffering into felt violations and victims into credible narrators of their own experiences. Third-party witnesses were no longer the sole arbiters of events. The trials shifted the familiar narrative of patriotic redemption or tragic revelation that glorified combat or underscored its folly to another account of trauma and survival that underscored victims' refusal of passivity. They also redeemed victims, making broken men whole by affirming the collective values of the community, giving voice to their suffering, but also interpreting their experiences according to a familiar cultural script. That the trials were so stage managed underscores how self-consciously lawyers and Tellerian himself sought to conform to audience expectations. The Holocaust became paradigmatic because, unlike these or colonial crimes, the Holocaust forced the West to grapple with its own murderousness, which could not be rationalized, even as it was cast in Nuremberg, for example, as an aberration rather than a structural feature of nation states. In this sense, the Holocaust of European Jewry was ultimately distinguished from other genocides because of the prominence given to it in a geopolitical order dominated by Western powers. But unlike earlier Armenian and Jewish victims, the recognition of Jewish suffering depended on the redemptive narratives that made victims credible witnesses, incorporating them into a narrative of heroism and survival rather than abjection and passivity, including in Israel. They became symbolic composites of darkness and hope, of homelessness and redemption, possessors of dark knowledge, whose heroism was not bound to honor, but to survival. Their suffering only became legible under certain conditions that victims shaped but did not define. This perspective focuses not on the paradigmatic status of the Holocaust as the teleological outcome either of the event's singularity or of Western political power, but as a long figurative and political process through which Holocaust survivors became exemplary victims of radical moral transgression, a dubious privilege that is only now beginning to wane. As genocide became a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape in the global South, another victim of genocide emerged along the Holocaust survivor and who testifies to Western failure to prevent genocide. Yeah, I think this tells you everything. If you contrast the image of the Eichmann trial, and there are many other images and images since then of Holocaust survivors and of the experience that tried to recount or capture the experience of Holocaust survivors, and then you look at these books. This is a series called Bearing Witness, and as you can see, it's supposed to cover genocide, but the Bosnian conflict ends up as one of these, even though it's not called genocide, but ethnic cleansing. Though, if we look at the next slide, we will see that indeed the Bosnian conflict is referred to as genocide, and the man who wrote these essays calling it genocide and basically comparing the war in the Balkans to, or what happened to Bosnian Muslims in the Balkans to what happened to European Jewry undercover the First World War, that they were basically the same thing. And of course, you also have Hillary Clinton writing prefaces to these kinds of books. So they're actually become an industry. Now, this global victim, who is portrayed in all of these, in this whole series, in whose name we all bear witness, represents, I would argue, the West's imaginative limits. Such victims are represented culturally as abstract embodiments of generic suffering. And if you think back to can we go back one slide? This, I think, captures that, this kind of abstract embodiment of generic suffering, who become international causes to the degree that teams of expert human rights lawyers, NGOs, and medical specialists speak of or bear witness on their behalf. Hence the persistent stubbornness, or at least lack of a consensus among Western powers to recognize, and Western populations and audiences until very recently, to recognize colonial crimes as genocides, even while acknowledging more vigorously than ever the necessity of prosecuting crimes against humanity. Victim testimony today is therefore a lament and a haunting reminder, as if we needed one, that never again is as ever now. Thank you.
Yes, Carolyn, thank you very much. A fantastic lecture. One of the issues that seems to be very problematic in understanding genocide is the confusion between genocide as a crime and genocide as a concept. And making a concept into a crime is a very particular process. And I think my sense is that it underlies a lot of the kind of struggling with this as you're talking about, is that we're never quite sure whether we're looking at something, a phenomenon that needs to be understood or a crime that needs to be prosecuted. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that tension.
Yeah, well, that's a very big question, actually. I think let me try to think about how to address that. I think the beginning, when I was talking about the two different narratives, the narrative that, in which you have a belated recognition of the Holocaust, and then you eventually now have the Holocaust as this icon of evil that dehistoricizes the event and is now lamented because it's been commercialized, et cetera, et cetera. You have that, and then you have the what I would associate with Dirk Moses and others, this idea that somehow the Holocaust has blotted out the recognition of other crimes. Both of them are problematic, but both of them agree. The only thing they agree on, I think, is that genocide as a crime depoliticized the concept as it had been developed by Lemkin. So Lemkin develops this concept, which, and this is, I began by this for the reason that you are obviously putting your finger on this tension, because cultural genocide expressed something that actually could not be litigated very easily, right? Because how do you remedy the destruction of language and culture? So the destruction of Yiddishkeit, of Yiddish, how do you remedy that crime? Now, the reason for this is fairly straightforward. It is because the Allied powers and many other countries, especially recently formed post-colonial states had no desire to have anybody have their national minorities suing them on the grounds of cultural destruction. So that the consensus was fairly simple. And so the argument is that for both of these narratives, that the concept, while very rich in practice, was depoliticized. Where they diverge, though, and this is where we could have a very interesting discussion, is that, in my view, and this is just my view, the kind of post-colonial narrative, and it's not only post-colonial, it's a complicated narrative, tends to say that the idea that the Holocaust became paradigmatic is very much because of Zionism, because Jews wanted a state in Palestine. Jews appended themselves to Western powers in order to realize this dream, and therefore, that is basically the argument. I don't mean to be so reductive, but in some way it is the argument. And that is why I emphasize so much the extent to which victims were not in control of this narrative, that victims, and there were as many Jews, we all know this, as many Jews who were, though the Holocaust changed some of this, but many Jews who were not Zionists, right? There's no room for victimization. There's no room for the belated recognition of the Holocaust, I think, in this narrative. And it tends to be a very on-high political narrative. So that tension between concept and reality is always there. It's there in the empirical reality, in the historical reality of what happened to the concept genocide, and it is still there in the arguments. It is exactly where the arguments end up diverging and breaking down, which is everyone believes the concept is rich, and then says, but in reality, why was the concept evacuated of so much of its complexity? And I think everyone would agree it was evacuated of complexity. The question is, what are the reasons for that evacuation? And that is where the narratives diverge, and one narrative blames anti-Semitism, and one narrative blames the Jews. So, I'm being slightly reductive, but it sort of comes down to that. It's a little bit, and the Western powers, to be fair, everybody blames the Western powers. So.
Hi, Carolyn. It's nice to see you.
Nice.
More or less back at Brown. I'm not sure I can formulate a question, but I'm trying to think about how I would understand your argument, and possibly by parsing it and using slightly different categories. One of them is what I find is a difficulty in deploying the category of genocide, because first of all, there's a kind of conflation of a quantitative and a qualitative argument.
Yes.
Right? So the quantitative argument is that unimaginable numbers of people are murdered. Unimaginable numbers of innocent people are murdered simply because of who they are. And the qualitative argument, which to me is the more problematic, is that the purpose is the annihilation of a people, in other words, of some kind of coherent collective totality. And it seems to me that qualitative argument is what takes over in what we would call the sacralization of the victims of genocide, and a kind of model of the Holocaust that elevates a kind of quantitative paradigm of unimaginable mass murder into the destruction of a totality, meaning the destruction of a people. And it's in that kind of sacralizing language where the question of redemption arises. And you used the word redemption quite often in your narrative. And it seems to me that, if I understand correctly, that the way you're using these early trials is as kind of prefigurations of a kind of redemptive narrative that depends on the sacralizing impulse.
Yeah.
So that the controversy over the Eichmann trial has to do with Hannah Arendt's impulse, really, among other impulses, to desacralize the event and somehow to restore it as a political event, in a way the quantitative without the qualitative and then to criticize the sacralization of the state, of the new state, of the Israeli state, on the backs of the sacralization of the Holocaust. So, my question is there a polemical dimension to your argument that continues this argument toward a kind of desacralizing impulse, a kind of restoration of a political narrative that could somehow restabilize various usages of the past in whatever their political context would be? I realize I'm ending with a kind of open and undefined situatedness of my own question. But the question is really, am I tracing your impulses in a way that speaks to you?
Yes. It's another excellent question. Let me, I think the best way I can answer that is first to say you put your finger on redemption, and that is crucial. And for me, what you call the desacralizing impetus is precisely to talk about how, when I use redemption, I'm trying to talk about how victims are reincorporated into moral communities, and that is what they don't control. And so in every instance that survivors become survivors, right, are symbolized as something that transcends, that the cultural meaning of the Holocaust as this radical moral transgression occurs only because, in my view, to some extent, the obvious need for victims to testify, of traumatized people to testify and be acknowledged and recognized and to mourn their losses, is transformed for audiences or by audiences, depending on the audience, can be transformed they are redeemed as victims. So they are reincorporated. Their survival is cast, as I said, in redemptive terms. So they have to either be incorporated into a nation, they have to be made into superior moral beings. Some redemptive process has to be undergone for these people to actually be able to be reintegrated into normative communities. And this process to me is the most troubling, because that is why Holocaust survivors are put on a pedestal. They are just people who've suffered something horrible. And yet they find themselves, as Primo Levi said, people ask me if I'm a prophet. Why would I be a prophet, right? And so the sacralization seems to me to have everything to do with audiences who want absolution, who want to cleanse the victims of the experience that they have actually undergone. Because, as you know, in Israel, these people were sources of tremendous stigma and shame. And this also happened in the immediate post-war period in Europe and the United States, in Jewish communities, right, as well. And so in order to reincorporate these people, it perhaps shouldn't be surprising, because this happens to victims all the time, there has to be some redemptive process that allows them to be culturally imagined as having, that the deaths became meaningful in some way. But not meaningful in the ways the victims want to memorialize them, but culturally meaningful. And so this process, which takes place in different ways over a long period of time, in which all these motifs emerge that speak to this experience, becomes meaningful, because my argument would be because there is a cultural demand to reincorporate victims in the terms, sorry, I'm in a city. You can't hear the sirens, probably I can. They're blasting. I have these on, sorry. I'm competing with sirens, so you'll forgive me. So that this redemptive process is very much a demand made on victims by audiences, and depending on who the audiences were, that process will be played out differently and in a different vocabulary. And the reason I focus on that is because the people who argue about that, Israel was a settler colony, none of which I'm going to argue with, fail to recognize the extent to which the victims had to struggle for recognition at all. And and they conflate the Zionists, who are often themselves eager to encourage people to move to Israel in this time, right? And who now have a new impetus for forming a Jewish state, how their alliance with Western powers, they feel somehow, it somehow makes them allies of the imperial powers, instead of victim groups. Not all of them are victim groups, right? But many of them are victims who have nowhere else to go. Many of them are people whose experiences are not recognized. And this is completely eliminated in the recounting of this story. Or they're seen as stooges, kind of people who end up going to this place and then they're fed a story about the uniqueness of the Holocaust and they buy it. There is no very persuasive explanation of how this came to be, of how this story of the cultural meaning of genocide how it came to be. Other than that, Jews thought that their experience was somehow unique, and then perpetuated this myth, right, against the myth, against the violence of other crimes. Now, when you talk about qualitative versus quantitative, this is exactly this divergence. That usually the quantitative is the depoliticized, right? Because it means you just define genocide as a lot of people die. And there's no way to define, at least as genocide is evolved, it has never, ever been without a cultural meaning that made the physical murders meaningful. So the question is, how was historically, since mass murders took place all the time, and they were seen as horrible violations of human laws, of the laws of humanity. My interest was, how did this, this horror that was the horror of the dismayed Western spectator, gazing on the barbarism elsewhere, usually, right? How is this transformed into a murder that became a radical moral transgression of an entirely different sort, with its heroes, it's a whole cast of characters, right, that made it meaningful when it was really death and destruction for millions of people. And it's this meaning that has not been replicated for other genocides other than the Holocaust. So this so other genocides are seen in terms of quantity by Western viewers. And that is equally problematic, right? And so I had to, at the same time, try to say, well, why is it that the Holocaust is seen as somehow different when it's different, but it's not somehow, why is it paradigmatic? And why is it also that the Holocaust, the meaning attributed to the Holocaust isn't because it is a unique crime, and it isn't because Jews somehow have always thought that, even if that is true, that they may think that Jews think that. It's about how was that meaning constructed in the first place, or constituted in the first place. And so those two questions together, how the quantitative and the cultural were joined were intersected when we talk about the Holocaust of European Jewry, and they were not with other crimes. And that's the story that Moses tries to tell too, but ends up, I think, ultimately not telling a satisfactory story.
You've got me thinking about similar situations. Rwanda, for example. I know nothing about how people in Rwanda or people in East Africa more generally think about what happened in Rwanda. Are there parallels? Do you have any idea?
About what happened, you mean, or?
No, not about what happened, but about sacralization, memorialization. Are there parallel processes to what you've described happening in the so-called West?
Well, I mean, there are, of course, of memorialization, but there are museums, and all
Yeah.
these museums have their own narratives that are right. What often people, I'm thinking of Mbembe and Mamdani and now Moses in a new mode, who are really very, very interesting, that these scholars tend to focus on the way that the Holocaust has become a reference even for the people trying to memorialize, as you said, say the Rwandan genocide. There's a museum in Kigali that has a room devoted to Auschwitz.
Wow.
And you want to ask why. And then, and there are, and while obviously the Holocaust is not the major reference, say, if you speak, for instance, there are people who will know this better than I, but in China, the reference for Chinese nationals is usually the Japanese invasion, right? That is the Holocaust, right? And so obviously, you know, this is not a global, it is global and yet it's not global. And so the questions are twofold. One is, why has the Holocaust become a global reference point? And the simple answer is Western power, and the Western power to define, and as I said, this other narrative that talks about the exportation of the Holocaust, and the fact that there are two ways of saying. One is that the Holocaust, if you look in Bosnia, you look elsewhere, that when the Holocaust, when you can show that there's been a lot of pressure to show that events are like the Holocaust in order to get UN action, for example, or especially Western action. And that's very problematic, right? And why is that? So that's some of the impetus that goes into thinking about these questions, which are absolutely important questions, very central questions, trying to sort of stop this. And then the other question is that I raised in the very beginning is, well, and Moses says this, you know, is genocide based on, and I think Adam was getting at this a little bit, genocide based on murder of who people were, is it somehow different than genocides that persecute and murder people because they represent a threat of some sort or another, politically and otherwise, right? Are these different? I mean, are they any less of genocides, right? And that's a really important question, and it's certainly much more germane to an imperial context. So, and you know, these arguments, and this is why and so this is what I was going to say. Sorry, one last thing is that what you can point out, which I think is important, is that genocide studies is usually called the Holocaust and genocide studies. And why should that be? I mean, the Holocaust is a genocide. So why, when you say genocide studies, is it always modified by, you know? And so that's a really important question, but that tells you a lot, right? That the Holocaust is somehow set aside as paradigmatic, and then there are other genocide. But the question of how you define, that's why, you know, the genocide concept is so ambiguous that's why everybody sort of, is it really a genocide? I don't know. And not only because it's consequential, because it's supposed to trigger, intervention, which it doesn't usually, and probably shouldn't, but also because the reasons for intervention are always political. They have little to do with whether something's really a genocide. But anyway, that's just a quick back of the envelope sort of comment.
Well, thank you. I think we have one more question, time for one more question. Tamara, please.
Carolyn, for a fantastic talk. I really learned a lot. And I think I have a very minor question really from the outset. And one of the things, many things I was struck by was the stamp of Petliura. And I suppose my question is just about what the place of something like that, if you could just say a little bit more about that in a genealogy of the moral witness, I suppose the place of counter narratives or what it is that is in this. I suppose I was curious about what that's doing in there. And I was wondering if you could say something more about that.
Oh, okay. There are so many ways to answer this, but the simplest way is that because this is so compressed, as you can imagine, one of the stories that attaches to all of these trials is the roles they play for communities that are marginalized and for whom these people remain heroes, though they're never recognized as heroes to anyone else, obviously. And so for example, Tellerian, today, if you talk to I have a friend of mine, an Armenian, and he remembers meeting him when he was a child, right? I mean, and there's still this sacred aura, right? And Schwarzbart, of course, Petlura was a legend among Jews in Eastern Europe. They used to always try to scare the children, because by talking about Petlura, who was the boogeyman who would get you if you didn't go to sleep and do what you brush your teeth and that sort of thing. And so they live on in memory. And what that stamp is there primarily to show the contrast, because this trial which I didn't have time to talk about, was played out and there's a historian who's written about this already, was played out as a trial that pitted Jews against Ukrainian nationalists. So that, and this story is still told that way. Instead of bringing people together, as you can imagine, it became a story about Jewish minorities pogroms sponsored by Ukrainians. And so this stamp was kind of another, even though nobody's ever proven that Petlura actually instigated the pogroms, we still don't know if he did. And some people don't believe he did. Now, whether or not that's the case, there was a stamp issued in Ukraine as part of a nationalist, sort of resurgence in 2004 that has only grown. And that was there for that reason, to contrast the Israeli memorialization of Schwarzbart with the Ukrainian memorialization of Petlura, which harkens back to these national memories. Now, how that plays a role in the way I would very briefly, I realize I'm taking too long to answer these questions, but very briefly, I think that I guess one of the, and this is a very depressing thing, actually, one of the claims that I want to make over and over is how much these stories, these memorializations tend to become marginalized in the larger story. And that's part of this story, is that the moral witness is always written according to a cultural script. You know, if you think how Tellerian managed he never saw anything. I mean, it's horrible what happened to him. Obviously, he was a victim, but he just managed this audience beautifully, right? Because he had to. And you can see, I don't know if this highly stylized rhetoric, our dear father, they all call for they all say that the soldiers, it's a trope where they all say the soldiers did this for our father. In both trials, it's just a common rhetoric at the time, but so these are memorialized in some way. And what I'm fascinated by is how little these memorializations matter outside of these communities, right? And they matter in Israel, it matters in Ukraine, but the global memory of this and the moral witness that emerges has very little to do with those stories. And that to me is I'm not sure what to do with it other than to stress to what extent, and this is against both arguments. One validates the victims as glorious purveyors of dark knowledge, and the other says, oh, they're imperialist allies of the Western powers. And you want to say, can we look at how this image of victims was created instead of looking at what you think victims are actually doing, or what, right, or in who, or you're speaking in their name, and who are you speaking for? So that's part. So you're getting it in some ways by asking that question. You're sort of pushing me to sort of say that is really the deep concern of the project, if that makes sense. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for a very stimulating and interesting talk. I know I learned a lot from it, and it provoked a lot of new questions in my mind. And so, yes, on behalf of the department and the university, it's been great to have you here at Brown again. And thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone for sitting through this. I appreciate your questions. They were very helpful.